The firebase went silent when the silhouette appeared through the smoke. Command had called off the rescue 40 minutes ago. The coordinates were compromised, the valley floor crawling with hostiles, and the weather window had collapsed into something the meteorologists were calling a thermal anomaly, superheated air rising from burning oil fields mixing with mountain winds to create conditions that turned radar into static and instruments into liars. 6 SEALs were pinned in a compound 3 clicks from the Pakistani border, ammunition critical, casualties mounting, and the word from Bagram was clear: nobody flies. The Apache crews sat in their cockpits with rotors spooling down. The fast movers had already turned back. And then someone in the tower said it, barely audible over the radio chatter, a call sign that made the air traffic controller reach for his logbook like he was checking his own sanity. Hog 7-3 is airborne. The base commander looked up from the tactical display, his face doing something between confusion and anger. Who authorized that? Nobody answered because nobody knew. The A-10 had been third in the maintenance rotation, down for a hydraulic seal replacement, but somehow it was climbing through 8,000 feet with a full combat load, and a pilot who wasn't supposed to be anywhere near a cockpit today. Her name was Kiara Voss, call sign Maven, and she had 2 kids in elementary school back in Tucson, a mortgage she paid with deployment bonuses, and a reputation among the warthog community that existed mostly in whispers. She'd flown suppression runs in Helmand, close air support missions so tight that grunts said they could feel the cannon rounds passing overhead like angry thunder. She'd logged more stick time than pilots 10 years her senior, but she'd also been passed over FOR Chinese letter instructor positions twice, her personnel file decorated with phrases like lacks command presence and insufficient gravitas. What they meant was she smiled too much in briefings, answered questions from junior, enlisted without the proper hierarchical distance, and once brought homemade cookies to a mission debrief. The old guard didn't know what to do with competence wrapped in approachability, so they did what institutions do: they sidelined her. Today she'd been scheduled for admin duty, paperwork, and flight hour reconciliation, the kind of task designed to keep qualified pilots busy without actually letting them fly. But when the SEAL team's desperate transmission came through, when she heard the platoon sergeant's voice crack on the words, "We're not making it out," she'd walked past the duty officer, signed out an aircraft that wasn't officially flight-ready, and rolled toward the taxiway while mechanics were still yelling about incomplete checklists. The valley was exactly as bad as advertised. Visibility dropped to quarter-mile the moment Maven descended below the ridgeline, the air thick with particulate matter that turned her windscreen into a smeared canvas of gray and amber. She switched her targeting pod to infrared, watching the landscape resolve into thermal signatures, hot spots from burning vehicles, the cooler blue shapes of buildings, and somewhere in that maze of compounds, 6 Americans who'd stopped believing rescue was possible. The SEAL's radio traffic had gone terse, the kind of clipped professionalism that comes when men accept they're measuring their lives in minutes. Any station, Dagger 16, we are Winchester on 40 Mike, taking effective fire from 3 sides, 2 urgent surgical. Maven keyed her mic, her voice calm enough to make the JTAC back at the firebase lean forward in his chair. Dagger 16, Hog 7-3, I'm your close air support, 30 seconds out, talk to me. The silence stretched long enough that she thought the radio might be dead. Then the SEAL platoon sergeant came back, and there was something in his voice that made her grip the stick tighter. Hog 7-3, advise you are single ship, no fast mover support, weather is below minimums for rotary extract, how copy? He was giving her an out, a professional way to say this is suicide, save yourself. Maven checked her fuel, her ordnance load, the way her aircraft was shuddering through the thermals like a truck on a washboard road. The A-10 had been built for exactly this kind of chaos, designed by people who understood that close air support wasn't about elegance. It was about flying low and slow and angry into places where nothing else could survive. Dagger 16, good copy on all, I'm here until you're not, give me a mark on hostile positions. The JTAC at the firebase pulled up her service record on his tablet, scrolling through deployments and commendations, looking for some explanation for what he was hearing. The aircraft commander stood behind him, arms crossed, watching the thermal feed from a Reaper drone circling uselessly above the weather. "She's got kids," someone said, like that explained anything, like motherhood was supposed to make pilots cautious instead of ferocious. The first gun run was a geometry problem written in tracer fire. The SEALs were holed up in a two-story compound with walls thick enough to stop small arms but not RPGs, and the hostiles had figured out the angles, massing in buildings 60 meters north and east. Maven rolled in from the south, nose down 30 degrees, the GAU-8 spooling up with a sound like industrial machinery digesting sheet metal. She pickled the trigger at 4,000 feet, walking the cannon fire across the northern building's roofline with the precision of someone threading a needle at 200 knots. Concrete exploded into dust clouds, steel support beams sheared, and the building's second floor pancaked into the first with a rumble that the SEALs felt through their boots. Good hits, good hits. Northern position destroyed. Shift fire east 150 meters. She pulled up hard, the G-forces compressing her spine, and came around for the eastern target while her aircraft's threat warning receiver screamed about radar locks that kept appearing and vanishing in the electromagnetic chaos. The eastern building was trickier, closer to the SEAL position, surrounded by low walls that channeled fire into overlapping kill zones. Maven switched to Mavericks, designating with her targeting pod while flying with her knees, the missile seeker head locked onto a technical truck's heat signature. The AGM-65 came off the rail clean, motor igniting in a white flash, and tracked straight through a window that couldn't have been more than 4 feet wide. The explosion was catastrophic, secondary detonations suggesting they'd hit an ammunition cache. The firebase commander was on the radio now, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected instant compliance. Hawk 7-3, Grizzly 6 Actual, you are not authorized for this mission, RTB immediately. Maven toggled to the SEAL frequency instead, ignoring the command net entirely. Dagger 1-6, what's your extract situation? We've got too little urgent, can move but need suppression on western buildings. They're massing for an assault. She'd burned through half her Maverick load and a quarter of her cannon rounds, and the weather was getting worse, the thermal currents slamming her around hard enough that her helmet cracked against the canopy frame. The A-10's titanium bathtub, the half-ton shell surrounding the cockpit, meant she could take hits that would obliterate faster aircraft, but it didn't make her invulnerable, just stubborn. Maven checked her fuel calculation against time on station, doing the math that every attack pilot knows by heart. How long can I stay before the choice gets made for me? The western buildings were a cluster of 3 structures arranged in an L shape, with alleys between them that offered protected movement for anyone trying to assault the SEAL compound. She needed to make those alleys uninhabitable, turn covered approaches into kill zones, and she needed to do it without putting ordnance anywhere near the good guys. The JTAC's voice crackled through, younger now, one of the SEALs pulling double duty. Hawk 7-3, be advised we are marking our position with infrared strobe. Can you identify? Maven's targeting pod picked up the flashing beacon immediately, a single pulsing star in the thermal gray. Dagger Maven, I've got your strobe. You're 60 meters south of the western structures. I'm going to make it loud. She came in from the west this time, into the sun if there'd been a sun visible through the smoke, and rippled off 2 Mavericks in sequence, each locked onto separate buildings. The missiles impacted within a second of each other, and the shockwave was visible even through the haze, a pressure wave that flattened antennae and scattered debris across 300 meters. Then she rolled inverted, a maneuver the A-10 wasn't really designed for, and dove at the third building with her cannon, the GAU-8's depleted uranium rounds chewing through walls like they were drywall. The platoon sergeant's voice came back with an edge she hadn't heard before. Hawk 7-3, Dagger 1-6, hostile assault broken. You just bought us time. What's your fuel state? Maven glanced at her gauge and felt that familiar tightness in her chest that combat pilots learn to breathe through. She had maybe 15 minutes before she'd be forced to climb out, and the nearest tanker was 200 miles away across weather that was marginalizing aircraft twice as fast as she was. But 15 minutes was a lifetime in a gunfight, and the SEALs were still stuck. Dagger, Maven, I'm good for another few passes. What else you got? The firebase commander was on the radio again, and this time there was something different in his voice, less command and more concern. 7-3 Grizzly 6, we're tracking at least 40 personnel massing in compounds to your north. They're organizing for a coordinated assault. You need to egress now while you've got altitude. Maven looked at her ordnance display. 4 Mavericks left, maybe 800 rounds of 30 Mike, and a pair of sidewinders that were useless in ground attack. The math wasn't complicated. 40 hostiles against 6 wounded SEALs meant overwhelming odds, meant that if she left now, she'd be attending memorial services in a month. Grizzly 6, Hog 7-3, I'm staying. There was a long pause, and when the commander came back, his voice had changed again, professional respect replacing command authority. Copy 7-3, we're scrambling a CSAR package. Estimate 25 minutes for medical extract. Can you hold that long? 25 minutes. Maven did the fuel calculation in her head and knew it was impossible. But she also knew that SEALs don't ask for help unless the situation is catastrophic, and that every minute she could buy them was another minute closer to salvation. Grizzly 6, affirm, I'll be here. The JTAC at the firebase pulled up weather data, trying to find her a route out after the extract, and his face went pale when he saw the forecast. The thermal anomaly was intensifying, creating wind shears that helicopters couldn't navigate and visibility dropping below emergency minimums. The hostile assault came in waves, like watching a tactics manual written by people who'd studied American response times. They hit from 3 sides simultaneously, small teams moving in coordinated rushes, while heavier weapons laid suppressing fire from protected positions. Maven caught the first wave halfway across open ground, dropping a Maverick into a cluster of fighters using a burned-out truck for cover. The explosion sent bodies cartwheeling, and the assault on that flank faltered. But the other 2 groups kept coming, and she had to choose, east or west, which group gets the next missile, which group gets lived with. She went east because the thermal signature showed more personnel, and the Maverick tracked true into a doorway that erupted in a fireball that suggested they'd been staging ammunition there. That left the western assault, and she was out of missiles, which meant cannon work, which meant getting low and slow and close enough that small arms fire became a serious concern. Maven dropped to 800 feet, insane altitude for close air support in hostile territory, and lined up her run while tracers started rising toward her like angry fireflies. The GAU-8's distinctive BRRRRT echoed across the valley as she walked fire across the western assault group, the cannon's recoil actually slowing her airspeed. Men scattered and died, and the assault broke apart into individuals seeking cover instead of a coordinated unit. Dagger 1-6, Hog 7-3, second assault broken. You've got maybe 10 minutes clear, use it. The platoon sergeant's response was clipped, professional, but underneath it Maven could hear something that sounded like gratitude mixed with disbelief. Copy 7-3, we're consolidating for extract. Can you maintain coverage? Her fuel gauge was screaming at her now, yellow caution lights illuminating across her panel, and she'd crossed into the zone where getting home became a statistical improbability. But the CSAR package was inbound. She could hear the PAVE Hawks checking in on the rescue frequency, and 10 minutes was survivable. Dagger, Maven, I've got you covered. The next 12 minutes were an education in violence economics. Maven circled the compound in a racetrack pattern, low enough that insurgents with RPGs started taking shots, the rockets passing close enough that she could see them through her canopy before they tumbled away into the smoke. She'd burned through her remaining cannon ammunition in 3 passes, each one targeting fighters trying to regroup in the compounds to the north, and now she was down to intimidation and angles, keeping her aircraft visible, making noise, convincing everyone below that the moment they moved, death would arrive at 6,000 rounds per minute even though her magazines were empty. The Pave Hawks came in fast and angry, flying formation, so tight they looked like a single aircraft with too many rotors, and the CSAR pararescuemen were on the ground for 90 seconds before they had all 6 SEALs loaded and were pulling pitch to climb out. The platoon sergeant's final transmission was brief enough to fit between rotor thumps. Hog 7-3, Dagger 1-6, we're clear. You're a goddamn legend, get yourself home. Maven watched them disappear into the gray haze, banking north toward Bagram, and only then did she let herself look at her fuel gauge properly. She had maybe 8 minutes of flight time before flameout, and the nearest runway was 14 minutes away at cruise speed through stable air. The weather she was looking at wasn't stable. It was a maelstrom of thermals and wind shear that would add time and burn fuel at rates she couldn't afford. The firebase commander came on the radio, and his voice had the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. 7-3, Grizzly 6, we've got a tanker trying to push through the weather, but estimate is 25 minutes to your position. What's your fuel state? She could lie, could buy herself a few more minutes of hope before physics made the decision for her. But pilots don't lie about fuel, not when other people's decisions depend on accurate information. Grizzly 6, Hog 7-3, I'm showing 600 pounds, estimate 8 minutes to flameout. The silence on the radio was absolute. 600 pounds of JP-8 in an A-10 meant the end of the story was already written, meant she'd bought the SEALs' lives with her own, a transaction that combat pilots understand intellectually but never actually expect to execute. The firebase commander's voice came back, and he wasn't bothering with call signs anymore, wasn't maintaining the professional distance that military protocol demanded. Maven Grizzly 6, we're not giving up on you. Turn heading 030, climb to Angels 12. We're going to get that tanker to you. She started the climb, feeling her warthog struggle through the turbulent air, the fuel gauge dropping with arithmetic precision. 8 minutes became 7, then 6, and the tanker was still 15 minutes out, pushing through weather that should have grounded it hours ago. Maven thought about her kids, about the homework she'd never check again, the soccer games she'd miss, the graduations and weddings and grandchildren that would exist without her. She thought about the SEALs in that compound, alive because she'd refused to accept that some things were impossible. The math wasn't complicated. 6 lives for one, and all 6 of them had families too, had people waiting. But she'd be lying if she said she was at peace with it. At 4 minutes to flame out, something impossible happened. The clouds broke. It wasn't a weather phenomenon, wasn't something meteorologists could explain. The thermal currents had been intensifying, the smoke getting thicker, and then suddenly there was a gap, a corridor of clear air that stretched toward the east like the valley itself was exhaling. And in that gap, descending through airspace that should have been impenetrable, was a KC-135 tanker flying at an altitude that violated every safety protocol, the boom operator already extending the refueling probe like a hand reaching into darkness. The tanker pilot's voice came through, southern accent thick enough to spread on toast. Hog 7-3, Texaco 25, I hear you're thirsty, let's get you a drink. Maven had executed aerial refueling hundreds of times, a ballet of closure rates and alignment that became muscle memory after enough repetitions. But she'd never done it at 8,000 feet in turbulent air with a fuel gauge showing 200 pounds and dropping. She closed on the tanker's boom with corrections so small they were almost subliminal, feeling her aircraft shake and buck, while the boom operator talked her in with the calm professionalism of someone who decided that today nobody was dying on his watch. Forward 3, steady, steady, contact. The boom locked into her refueling receptacle with a thunk she felt through the airframe, and JP-8 started flowing, the gauge climbing with the kind of beauty that only people who have faced death by mathematics can fully appreciate. She took on 3,000 pounds, enough to get home and then some, and when the tanker pilot told her to disconnect, his voice had lost all professional distance. Maven, Texaco 25, you did good today. Let's both get home safe. The firebase was waiting when she landed, and what happened next became the kind of story that spread through the military community in whispers and finally in official commendations. The SEALs she'd saved were waiting at the flight line, and when she climbed out of her cockpit, the platoon sergeant did something that SEALs almost never do. He saluted first, a gesture of respect that acknowledged she'd earned something that couldn't be assigned by rank or position. The base commander was there too, and his face was doing something between anger at protocol violations and awe at what she'd accomplished. He started to say something about unauthorized missions and court-martial procedures, and the SEAL sergeant cut him off with words that made the assembled maintenance crews go silent. Sir, with respect, that pilot saved 6 American lives in conditions that grounded everyone else, and if there's any paperwork that needs doing, it should be award citations, not reprimands. The story should end there, with Maven standing in the Afghan dust surrounded by people who finally understood what she'd been trying to prove her entire career. That competence doesn't require gravitas, that approachability doesn't diminish skill, that bringing cookies to debriefs doesn't mean you can't fly into hell when the situation demands it. But stories in the military don't end cleanly. They echo forward through careers and policies, and the quiet ways that institutions learn to change. Maven did face a review board, 3 full-bird colonels who sat in a conference room at Bagram and listened to her explain why she'd taken an aircraft that hadn't completed maintenance checks, violated direct orders to return to base, and committed to a mission that exceeded safe fuel margins by any reasonable calculation. She didn't apologize, didn't frame her actions as mistakes made under pressure. She simply laid out the tactical situation, the capabilities of her aircraft, and the assessment that led her to conclude 6 Americans dying was unacceptable when she had ordnance and skill to prevent it. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. When they emerged, the senior colonel was carrying a file folder that he set on the table with the kind of precision that suggested its weight was more than paper. Captain Voss, this board finds your actions on the date in question to constitute a violation of operational protocols, unauthorized use of military assets, and disregard for direct orders from command authority. Maven felt her career ending in real time, felt the years of training and deployment and proving herself collapsing into a discharge that would mark her as too unreliable for command. Then the colonel opened the folder and pulled out a different document, and his voice changed, became something that sounded almost like respect. This board also finds your actions to constitute extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire, superior airmanship under impossible conditions, and the kind of judgment that saved American lives at significant personal risk. You're being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I'm personally recommending you for an instructor position at the weapons school. The change in the Warthog community wasn't instantaneous, wasn't a dramatic shift that happened overnight. But Maven became a call sign that junior pilots heard in bars and briefing rooms, a name attached to the kind of mission that defined what close air support meant when everything else failed. She did go to weapons school, and her classes became legendary for their focus on impossible decisions, the moments when protocol and reality diverged, when pilots had to choose between safety and mission, between career and conscience. She taught with the same approachability that had once been marked against her, answered questions from students without hierarchical distance, and yes, sometimes brought cookies to graduation ceremonies. But nobody questioned her gravitas anymore, because gravitas isn't about how you stand in a briefing room. It's about what you do when the radio goes silent and good people are dying, and everyone else has already turned for home. Her kids grew up watching their mother become something that the military had rarely acknowledged, a combat pilot who didn't fit traditional templates, who proved that effectiveness could look different than expected, that the best warriors weren't always the ones who projected conventional command presence. They learned early that their mom was famous in a community that didn't grant fame easily, that SEALs asked about her in hushed tones, that maintenance crews competed to work on her aircraft. The A-10 she'd flown that day, tail number 73, was eventually retired after accumulating too many flight hours and too much combat damage. But before it was flown to the boneyard, the crew chiefs painted something on the nose, a tradition usually reserved for aircraft with multiple kills or historic missions. They painted 6 small stars, one for each seal, and below it a single phrase that became shorthand for a certain kind of impossible heroism: Maven's promise. Because that's what she'd done in that valley, made a promise that she'd stay until the job was finished, and then kept it despite mathematics and weather and orders from people who weren't in the cockpit. The SEALs she saved stayed in touch, a quiet fraternity bound by the understanding that they'd been written off and then rewritten by a pilot who refused to accept that some costs were acceptable. They attended her promotion ceremonies, showed up when she taught at weapons school, and years later, when she finally retired with a rank and recognition that would have seemed impossible during those early years of being sidelined, they were there for that too. The platoon sergeant gave a speech at her retirement ceremony, and he told the story exactly as it happened. The weather, the odds, the fuel gauge counting down toward zero, and the moment when he realized that the pilot on the other end of the radio wasn't calculating survival odds for herself, only for his team. He ended with something that made the assembled crowd of pilots and commanders and Pentagon officials go silent. We talk a lot in the military about heroism, about courage under fire and selfless service. But until you've been on the wrong end of a tactical situation, completely out of options, and heard a voice on the radio say, "I'm staying," you don't really understand what those words mean. Captain, excuse me, Colonel Voss, showed us what they mean. She showed us that sometimes the most important qualification isn't in your service record. It's in your refusal to accept that good people should die when you've got the ability to prevent it. The Apache pilots who'd been grounded that day stood in the back of the ceremony, and several of them approached Maven afterward with something that looked like apology mixed with understanding. They'd followed orders, had made the professional calculation that the weather and tactical situation exceeded safe operational parameters. And they'd been right. By every reasonable standard, Maven's mission should have ended in a smoking crater and a memorial service. That it hadn't was due to skill and determination, and a gap in the weather that meteorologists still couldn't explain, a combination of factors that couldn't be replicated or recommended as doctrine. But it had happened, and the fact that it happened changed something fundamental about how the community thought about acceptable risk and impossible situations. Maven's children grew up understanding that their mother was a legend without fully grasping why legends existed. They knew the story. Mom had saved some soldiers, had flown through bad weather, had done something important. But it wasn't until they were adults, until one of them enlisted and went through flight training themselves, that they understood the weight of what she'd accomplished. Her daughter, Kiera Jr., though everyone called her KJ, was sitting in a briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base during weapons school when an instructor pulled up a case study about risk assessment and acceptable losses. The tactical scenario was familiar: troops in contact, weather below minimums, aircraft grounded by command order. The instructor worked through the decision tree, showing how professionals calculated odds and made rational choices to preserve assets. Then he pulled up the actual mission footage, drone feed and cockpit audio from a real incident, and KJ recognized her mother's voice on the radio, calm and determined, making promises that mathematics said she couldn't keep. The instructor paused the playback and looked at the assembled students, all of them experienced combat pilots selected for advanced training. This mission violates every protocol we teach. The pilot disregarded direct orders, exceeded safe fuel margins, and committed to a tactical situation with no viable exit strategy. By every professional standard, this should have been a catastrophic failure. He let that sit for a moment, watching the students process the impossible decisions they were watching. Instead, it became the textbook example of what close air support actually means, not the planned missions with full support packages, but the moments when everything goes wrong and people are dying and you have to choose between the safe professional choice and the human one. The pilot's name was Kiera Voss, call sign Maven, and she taught here for 5 years before her retirement. Some of you may have heard the stories. All of them are true. KJ sat in that briefing room feeling something between pride and understanding, finally grasping why strangers sometimes stopped her mother in airports, why maintenance crews treated her aircraft with extra care, why her personnel file was thick with commendations and thin with the kind of negative evaluations that had marked her early career. The legacy extended beyond one pilot's career, rippling through policies and training programs and the subtle ways that military culture adapted. The phrase "Maven's Promise" became shorthand in the A-10 community for missions that exceeded safe parameters but accomplished objectives that couldn't be abandoned. It appeared in after-action reports, in tactical debriefs, in the conversations that pilots had after flights when they discussed the margins between successful missions and catastrophic ones. The Air Force created a new training scenario based on the mission, running weapons school students through simulations that replicated the weather, the fuel constraints, the tactical situation, and the impossible choice between professional protocols and human responsibility. Most students failed the scenario, making rational decisions to preserve assets and minimize risk. The ones who passed understood something that couldn't be taught in briefing rooms, that sometimes the right choice violated every professional calculation, and that leadership meant accepting consequences for decisions that looked insane on paper but felt inevitable in the moment. Maven herself became an instructor for these scenarios, sitting in the debrief room while students explained their decision-making processes. She never told them what to choose, never suggested that her approach was the only valid response. Instead, she asked questions that forced them to examine their assumptions. What obligations do you have to people on the ground? What risks are acceptable when lives are immediate versus theoretical? How do you calculate the value of a promise made over radio to people who have accepted their dying? The questions didn't have clean answers, which was exactly the point. The best pilots weren't the ones who followed protocols blindly or violated them recklessly. They were the ones who understood when rules served the mission, and when the mission demanded something rules couldn't anticipate. Years after her retirement, Maven was invited back to Bagram, now dramatically changed by political transitions, but still recognizable to anyone who'd served there during the peak years. The firebase where she'd violated orders was smaller now, repurposed, but the tower was still there, and some of the same support personnel were still serving. They'd erected something that military bases rarely sanctioned for living personnel, a memorial marker, not for death, but for a mission that defined what service meant when everything else failed. It was a simple plaque mounted on the flight line, bronze that was already weathering to green, with text that captured the essential truth. On this date, Captain Kiera Voss, call sign Maven, flew into conditions that grounded all other aircraft and saved 6 American lives through extraordinary airmanship, disregard for personal safety, and refusal to accept that some costs were inevitable. Her actions demonstrated that the most important qualification for combat aviation isn't in the flight manual, it's the determination to stay when everyone else has left. The SEALs were there for the dedication, all 6 of them, older now and scattered across different commands but still bound by what happened in that valley. They stood in formation behind Maven while a 2-star general who'd been a captain during her controversial mission gave a speech about calculated risks and professional judgment. But when the general finished, the platoon sergeant stepped forward without invitation and spoke with the blunt honesty that SEALs deployed when political niceties seemed obscene. Everything the general said is true and also completely misses the point. Maven didn't save us through airmanship or professional judgment. She saved us because when command said we were expendable, and weather said rescue was impossible and mathematics said she couldn't survive the mission, she looked at those facts and said, "I don't care, I'm staying." That's not in any manual. That's just who she is. The Warthog community sent a formation flight. 5 A-10s flying in missing man formation, breaking off one aircraft directly over the ceremony in a maneuver so old it had been used for pilots in World War. Maven watched them climb through the clear Afghan sky, and for the first time since the mission, she allowed herself to feel what she'd pushed aside during those minutes of counting down fuel and calculating impossible odds. She'd been terrified. Not of dying, that was just mathematics resolving, but of failing, of having 6 families learn their loved ones had died because she hadn't been skilled enough or determined enough or lucky enough. The fear never fully left, she realized. It lived in every mission she'd flown after, every student she'd taught, every briefing where she'd emphasized that competence meant understanding your limits and sometimes exceeding them anyway. You carried that fear the way pilots carried flight suits, as part of the essential equipment, the weight that reminded you the stakes were real. Her daughter approached after the ceremony, wearing the flight suit of a newly qualified A-10 pilot, and Maven saw in her face the same determination that had made her ignore fuel gauges and weather reports and direct orders. "Mom, they told me today that I'm being assigned to the same squadron you flew with. Same call sign tradition." Maven felt something in her chest tighten, the protective instinct of a parent mixing with the professional understanding that her daughter had chosen this path fully aware of what it demanded. "Maven's a good call sign. You'll live up to it." "Actually," KJ said, pulling out her assignment paperwork, "they're giving me something different. Said Maven belongs to you, that call signs that legendary don't get recycled. They're calling me Promise." And there it was, the legacy that mattered more than awards or promotions or plaques on flight lines. The understanding that what Maven had done in that valley wasn't about violating protocols or executing impossible missions. It was about making promises to people who'd been abandoned, and then keeping them despite every logical reason to fail. That was what got passed forward, not as procedure or doctrine, but as culture, as the unwritten code that bound combat aviation communities together. The ceremony ended with something traditional and yet deeply personal. The maintenance crew that had serviced Maven's A-10 on that long-ago day had saved something, a small piece of the aircraft's skin, aluminum scarred by shrapnel and heat, and the violence of close air support in impossible conditions. They'd mounted it on a wooden base, and they presented it to her with words that maintenance crews rarely spoke to pilots. "This is from 7-3. She brought you home, and we want you to remember that aircraft don't fail pilots. They're partners, and that day you trusted her completely and she delivered." Maven took the scarred aluminum, feeling its weight, seeing the marks that represented a mission where everything had aligned just enough to achieve the impossible. She thought about the tanker pilot who'd violated every safety protocol to reach her, about the SEAL team that had held their position just long enough, about the weather gap that had appeared when she'd had 2 minutes of fuel remaining. None of it should have worked. All of it had been necessary. She gave a speech that was shorter than military ceremony typically demanded, but the assembled crowd of pilots and support personnel and SEALs listened with the kind of attention that suggested her words carried weight beyond rank. People will tell you that what happened in that valley was about exceptional airmanship or extraordinary courage. That's partially true, but it misses the essential point. What happened was about refusing to accept that some people are expendable, that some situations are impossible, that some promises can't be kept. Every person on the ground who supported that mission, the tanker crew, the CSAR package, the weather forecasters trying to find me a route home, the JTAC talking me onto target, they all made the same choice. Nobody was willing to write off 6 Americans just because the mathematics looked bad. That's not heroism. That's basic human decency applied in a tactical situation. And if there's any legacy I want to leave, it's that competence without compassion is just technical skill, but competence combined with the refusal to abandon people is what makes this profession meaningful. The applause was restrained, professional, but Maven saw something in the faces around her that mattered more than volume. Understanding. Acceptance. The recognition that military service at its best wasn't about following orders blindly or executing missions perfectly. It was about knowing when the situation demanded something beyond protocols and having the courage to provide it. She flew home commercial, sitting in coach surrounded by civilians who had no idea that the middle-aged woman reading a paperback had once kept a promise that mathematics said was impossible. Her kids met her at baggage claim in Tucson, older now and independent but still showing up for airport pickups because some traditions mattered. They drove home through desert landscape that looked nothing like Afghanistan but somehow reminded Maven of that valley, the way heat distorted distances, the sense that survival required understanding margins that weren't in any manual. "Mom," her son asked from the backseat, "do you ever regret it? The mission, I mean. You almost died." Maven thought about the question, about the SEALs who'd gone on to complete 20 more years of service, about the families who'd gotten their loved ones back, about the students she'd taught who'd faced their own impossible moments and had a framework for processing them. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that the situation got so bad that someone had to make that choice. But I don't regret making it. Those men deserved to come home, and I had the ability to make that happen. That's not really a choice. It's just what you do when you're capable and someone needs help." The simplicity of it struck her even as she said it. People tried to make the mission complicated, tried to analyze decision matrices and risk calculations and professional protocols. But stripped to its essential truth, it had been straightforward. People were dying, she could help, the cost was acceptable. Everything else was just paperwork. They pulled into her driveway, the house she'd bought with deployment bonuses, the yard that needed mowing, the ordinary suburban setting that looked nothing like flight lines or combat zones. Maven carried her bag inside and found herself standing in her living room, looking at the photos on the wall, her children's graduations, her promotion ceremonies, the candid shot of her with her A-10 during a deployment to Kandahar. And there, in a simple frame on the bookshelf, was something the SEALs had sent her years ago. A photograph of their team taken a week after the rescue, all 6 of them alive and grinning with the kind of relief that came from surviving impossible odds. They'd signed the back. "Maven, you kept your promise. We'll never forget." Maven stood in her living room, thousands of miles from Afghan valleys and tactical decisions, and allowed herself a moment of simple satisfaction. Not pride exactly, not the chest-thumping triumph that people imagined combat heroism required. Just the quiet knowledge that when the situation demanded it, when people were dying and mathematics said rescue was impossible, she'd refused to accept those facts. She'd made a promise, kept it, and come home to her own family. That was enough. The call sign followed her into retirement, appearing in unexpected places. Military history journals wrote case studies analyzing her decision-making. Aviation museums asked for her flight suit and helmet. Documentary filmmakers requested interviews, trying to capture what it felt like to fly into conditions that had grounded everyone else. Maven accommodated most of these requests with the same approachability that had marked her career, answering questions without self-aggrandizement, explaining tactical decisions without pretending they'd been easy. But she always steered conversations back to the team, the tanker pilot who'd risked everything to refuel her, the CSAR crews who'd executed a perfect extraction, the maintenance crews who'd kept her aircraft mission-capable despite incomplete checklists. Heroism, she insisted, was always plural, always the sum of people refusing to accept failure when lives were on the line. Her daughter's career progressed with the kind of steady competence that suggested the Voss name carried expectations. KJ flew combat missions in Syria, close air support in Africa, training exercises in Europe. She earned her own commendations, built her own reputation, and carefully avoided trading on her mother's legend, while understanding it was always present in how people evaluated her. During a particularly difficult mission over hostile territory, when her flight lead ordered a withdrawal due to weather, KJ found herself facing a familiar choice: follow professional protocols and abandon troops in contact, or violate orders and commit to a mission that exceeded safe parameters. The radio call from the ground controller was desperate, exactly the tone Maven had heard years ago. KJ made her decision without hesitation, but afterward, during the debrief when her commander asked what she'd been thinking, she gave an answer that would have made her mother proud. "Sir, I was thinking about what kind of pilot I wanted to be. Not the one who made safe decisions and abandoned people, but the one who kept promises even when mathematics suggested they couldn't be kept. I learned that from my mother, but more importantly, I learned it from the community she helped build. The understanding that sometimes close air support means staying when everyone else has left." The commander, a veteran of the Afghan surge who'd heard Maven's story in multiple briefings, nodded slowly. "Your mother violated direct orders during her mission. You're aware you did the same?" "Yes, sir. And I'm aware those orders existed for good reasons: asset preservation, risk management, chain of command. But I'm also aware that 6 Americans came home because someone decided those reasons weren't sufficient when weighed against human lives. I made the same calculation." The expected reprimand never came. Instead, KJ received a quiet commendation and a conversation with the squadron commander about judgment and acceptable risk that sounded very much like the briefings Maven had given at weapons school. The institution was learning, slowly, that the best pilots weren't always the ones who followed rules perfectly. Sometimes they were the ones who understood when rules served the mission, and when the mission demanded something rules couldn't anticipate. Maven heard about her daughter's mission through the informal network that connected retired pilots to active-duty communities. She didn't call KJ to discuss it, didn't offer advice or commentary. Instead, she sent a simple text: "Heard you kept your promise. Proud of you." 3 words that carried the weight of legacy, the understanding that what she'd started in that Afghan valley had become something larger than one mission or one pilot. It had become a standard, an expectation that competence meant more than technical skill. It meant the courage to apply that skill when the cost was high and the outcome uncertain. Years accumulated, and Maven settled into the rhythm of retirement that military veterans knew well: consulting work, aviation conferences, occasional teaching stints at institutions that valued experience over active-duty status. She watched the A-10 community evolve, seeing younger pilots carry forward the traditions while adapting to new technologies and threat environments. The Warthog itself faced perennial retirement discussions, Pentagon analysts arguing it was obsolete in an age of peer adversaries and advanced air defenses. But every time the conversation gained momentum, someone would bring up missions like Maven's, the times when nothing else could do the job, when troops on the ground needed an aircraft that could fly low and slow and angry into situations that would destroy faster, more sophisticated platforms. The arguments for retirement always lost to the reality that close air support wasn't about elegance or stealth. It was about being present when everyone else had left. Maven found herself called to testify before a congressional subcommittee about the A-10's future, sitting at a table with other retired pilots while politicians asked about capabilities and cost-effectiveness. She listened to technical presentations about sortie rates and maintenance hours, about airframe life and replacement platforms. Then a congresswoman from Wisconsin, whose brother had been a JTAC in Afghanistan, asked a different question. "Colonel Voss, setting aside technical specifications, can you tell this committee what the A-10 meant to troops on the ground?" Maven had prepared for technical questions, had brought charts and capability comparisons. Instead, she set those aside and told the truth. "Ma'am, the A-10 meant someone was staying. Every other platform, fast movers, helicopters, drones, they all had to calculate risk and fuel in tactical situations. The A-10 just stayed until the job was done. Troops knew that when they heard that distinctive cannon sound, when they saw that ugly gray aircraft circling overhead, it meant someone had committed to their survival without reservation. You can't replace that with specifications or sortie rates. That's about trust, about the promise that American air power meant we didn't abandon our people. The day we retire the A-10 is the day we tell troops on the ground that asset preservation matters more than their lives. I hope this committee chooses differently. The testimony went viral in military communities, shared across social media platforms and messaging apps, quoted in opinion pieces and strategic analysis papers. They received another funding extension, another reprieve from retirement, and Maven received messages from JTACs and ground controllers thanking her for articulating something they'd felt but couldn't express. That close air support wasn't just a tactical capability. It was a promise embodied in titanium and depleted uranium. She lived to see her grandchildren, KJ's twins, who grew up hearing stories about their grandmother and mother flying warthogs into impossible situations. They asked questions with the innocent directness of children. Did you kill people? Were you scared? What does it feel like to be a hero? Maven answered honestly, avoiding both glorification and false modesty. Yes, she'd killed people, enemy fighters who were trying to kill Americans, and while she'd made peace with that necessity, it wasn't something she celebrated. Yes, she'd been terrified, had spent entire missions calculating fuel and odds and accepting that she probably wouldn't survive. And no, she wasn't a hero, she was a competent pilot who'd refused to abandon people when abandoning them would have been easier and safer and more professionally rational. The twins absorbed these answers with the adaptability of children who'd grown up in military families, understanding that heroism wasn't simple, that courage and fear coexisted, that good people sometimes did violent things for necessary reasons. They'd learn more as they aged, would develop their own relationships with military service and sacrifice. But Maven's hope was that they'd understand the essential lesson: competence combined with compassion, skill applied with determination, the refusal to accept that some people were expendable. That was what service meant at its best. The firebase in Afghanistan was eventually abandoned, part of the broader withdrawal that ended America's longest war. The plaque honoring Maven's mission was removed during the retrograde, packed into a container, and shipped to Fort Liberty, where it was installed in the Air Ground Operations School. The building where it now resided trained the next generation of JTACs and forward air controllers, teaching them the protocols and procedures for directing close air support. And there, in the hallway between classrooms where students learned target coordinates and radio procedures, was the bronze plaque telling them that sometimes the most important lesson wasn't in the manual. It was knowing when to trust the pilot who said, "I'm staying." Maven visited once, walking through the school with a group of retired aviators attending a memorial service for a fallen comrade. She stopped in front of her own plaque, reading the words that had been written about her by people who'd needed her to be more than professionally competent, who'd needed her to be stubbornly determined to keep impossible promises. A young JTAC student approached, recognizing her from the photo displayed next to the plaque, and asked the question that every generation asked when confronted with legends from previous wars. "Ma'am, would you do it again? Knowing what you know now, would you still violate orders and risk your life?" Maven looked at the student, seeing in his face the same uncertainty every service member felt when contemplating the gap between training and reality, between protocols and the messy truth of combat. "I'd do it exactly the same way," she said, "because the alternative was 6 families getting folded flags and empty promises about honor and sacrifice. Those words mean something, but they mean a lot less than bringing people home alive. So yes, I'd do it again, and I'd hope that when you're in a similar situation, you'd have the courage to do the same." The student nodded, processing this, and Maven could see him filing it away for future reference, the moment when theory became something more concrete. That was how legacy worked, not through plaques and ceremonies, but through conversations that planted seeds, through examples that suggested possibilities, through the quiet transfer of values from one generation to the next. She flew home that evening, commercial aviation so mundane after decades of military flying that she barely registered the takeoff. But as the aircraft climbed through the clouds, she found herself looking out the window at the landscape below, thinking about all the times she'd flown this same trajectory in an A-10, loaded with ordnance and purpose, heading toward situations where people needed help in mathematics, suggested it was impossible to provide. The civilian passengers around her had no idea, would never know, and that was fine. Maven hadn't kept her promise in that Afghan valley for recognition or legend or plaques on walls. She'd done it because 6 Americans needed to come home, and she'd had the skill and determination to make that happen. Everything else, the awards, the legacy, the call signs and stories and congressional testimony, was just documentation of something simpler. When the situation demanded it, she'd stayed. And on that day, through skill and courage and luck that meteorologists still couldn't explain, staying had been enough. The evening sun cast long shadows across the American landscape as Maven's flight continued east, carrying her home to Tucson and grandchildren and the ordinary routines of retirement. Somewhere below, other pilots were flying, other missions were unfolding, other promises were being made and kept or broken. The tradition continued, carried forward by people like her daughter, by students who'd heard her testimony, by maintainers who understood that aircraft and pilots were partners in keeping promises that mathematics said couldn't be kept. Maven closed her eyes, feeling the gentle vibration of jet engines, and allowed herself something she rarely indulged: satisfaction. Not pride, not triumph, just the simple knowledge that when it mattered most, when 6 lives hung in the balance and everyone else had calculated the odds and found them wanting, she'd made a different calculation. She decided that coming home was optional, but keeping her promise wasn't. And on that day, through determination and skill and a gap in the weather that arrived exactly when hope was running out, she'd managed to do both. That was her legacy. That was what Maven meant. That was why, years later, when SEALs stood frozen watching an A-10 emerge from ash and smoke, they knew exactly what they were seeing: a promise kept, a pilot who'd stayed, and the proof that sometimes impossible just meant nobody had tried hard enough yet.